It was a quiet Friday afternoon in Pasadena, California. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the bustling streets. Inside the Western Gateway Bank, everything seemed ordinary. Customers shuffled through the lines, tellers worked behind their counters, and the soft hum of printers filled the air. Yet, what was about to happen within those walls was anything but ordinary. It would leave everyone there questioning how they saw the world, and most importantly, how they judged others. Elijah Carter stepped into the bank, his presence calm and unassuming. Dressed in a plain grey hoodie and a pair of well-worn jeans, he looked like any other customer, someone running a quick errand before the weekend. At 41 years old, Elijah wasn't one to dress to impress. He believed actions spoke louder than appearances. Yet, on this day, his choice of attire would become the reason for a shocking encounter he'd never forget. Elijah wasn't here for anything complicated. He just needed to pick up some documents he had left earlier in the week. He nodded politely to the security guard at the door, who returned the gesture with a smile. The air inside the bank was warm and familiar, and Elijah thought the errand would only take a few minutes. But as he approached the counter, a woman standing in the back office caught sight of him. Allison Parker, the branch manager, was sharp and confident. Her tailored blazer and perfectly polished shoes spoke of someone who prided herself on professionalism. She had an air of authority about her, one that often intimidated others. Spotting Elijah at the counter, she frowned slightly. Her eyes swept over him, taking in his casual clothes, his laid-back demeanor. A flicker of disapproval crossed her face, though she quickly masked it. "Can I help you?" she asked, striding toward him. Her tone was clipped, almost dismissive, as if she had already decided he didn't belong there. Elijah looked at her, his expression calm, and explained that he was there to retrieve his documents. The young teller behind the counter seemed ready to assist, but Allison cut her off with a quick gesture. "Let me handle this," she said, stepping in front of the teller. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Elijah. "I don't think I've seen you here before," she added, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion. "Do you even have an account with us?" The question wasn't asked out of genuine curiosity. It was loaded, her words steeped in assumptions. Elijah's relaxed demeanor didn't waver. He nodded politely and assured her that he had been banking there for years. But Allison wasn't convinced. Her tone grew sharper as she questioned him further, making it clear that she doubted his claim. Customers in the bank began to notice the exchange. Some glanced over curiously, sensing the tension. Others shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen but clearly aware of what was unfolding. Elijah, however, remained calm, his voice steady as he repeated his request. Yet, every response he gave seemed to fuel Allison's skepticism. "I don't think you are at the right branch," she said finally, folding her arms across her chest. "This location primarily serves our premium clients. If you're looking for basic services, you might want to try one of our larger branches." Her words stung, not because of their content, but because of what they implied. Elijah felt the weight of her assumptions pressing down on him. He wasn't dressed like the typical premium client she had in mind, and that seemed to be enough for her to dismiss him entirely. But he didn't let his frustration show. Instead, he calmly asked her to check under his name. Elijah Carter. Allison hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She instructed the teller to search the system, though she made it clear she thought it was a waste of time. As the teller typed nervously into her computer, Allison leaned closer to Elijah, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "Look," she said, her words dripping with false politeness. "We have policies here. If you don't meet the criteria for certain account tiers, we simply can't make exceptions. Perhaps next time you might want to come better prepared." Elijah's patience was being tested, but he refused to let her words provoke him. He stood silently, waiting for the teller to finish her search. Moments later, the young woman's face lit up with surprise. "Actually, his documents are here," she said timidly, holding up a folder. They were marked for secure pickup. The room grew quiet. Allison's confident demeanor faltered as she snatched the folder from the teller, her face flushing with embarrassment. She handed it to Elijah begrudgingly, muttering a quick, insincere apology. But Elijah wasn't going to let the moment pass so easily. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just out of curiosity, was there a reason this process had to be so complicated?" Alison stiffened, regaining a fraction of her composure. "We have to ensure security and verify credentials," she said defensively. "It's nothing personal." But Elijah wasn't buying it. He could see through her excuses, and so could everyone else in the room. The customers watched silently, their gazes shifting between Elijah and Alison, waiting to see what would happen next. Elijah took a step closer, his calm demeanor unwavering as he spoke again. "Are you sure it wasn't personal?" he asked, his tone measured but pointed. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like it was." Alison opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Her confidence was crumbling, and for the first time she seemed to realize the weight of her actions. But Elijah wasn't finished. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a sleek business card and handed it to her. "Perhaps this will help clarify things," he said, his voice steady. Alison hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the card. Her eyes scanned the bold lettering at the top, and in an instant her expression changed. The color drained from her face as she read the name printed there: Elijah Carter, founder and CEO, Western Gateway Bank. The silence in the bank was deafening. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on Alison as she stared at the business card in her trembling hands. Her carefully crafted confidence had vanished, replaced by a wave of confusion and disbelief. She glanced up at Elijah, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. It was as if the reality of the moment had rendered her completely speechless. Elijah, on the other hand, remained composed. He didn't smirk or gloat. That wasn't his style. Instead, his gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. There was no need for him to say anything more. The card in Alison's hand said enough. The truth of who he was and what he owned hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The customers who had been quietly watching the exchange began murmuring amongst themselves. A woman standing in line whispered to her friend, "Did he just say he owns the bank?" Another man, a middle-aged professional in a suit, shook his head in disbelief. The tension in the room was palpable, and the dynamic had shifted entirely. Alison finally found her voice, though it wavered as she spoke. "I didn't realize," she stammered, her face pale. "Mr. Carter, I—" But Elijah held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "It's all right," he said calmly. "We all make mistakes, but I'd like to understand why this mistake happened." His tone was firm yet measured, and it carried a weight that silenced any further excuses Alison might have had. She swallowed hard, her hands clutching the card like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Behind the counter, the young teller who had initially tried to help Elijah looked visibly relieved. She glanced at him with a mixture of gratitude and admiration, as though silently thanking him for standing his ground without resorting to anger. As the room buzzed with whispers, Elijah turned to face the gathered crowd. He offered a polite nod to the onlookers, his voice rising just enough to carry over the murmurs. "I appreciate your patience," he said, addressing the customers directly. "I didn't mean to disrupt anyone's afternoon." The sincerity in his voice seemed to resonate with the crowd, and a few people nodded back, their expressions softening. Elijah had no interest in making a scene. That wasn't the kind of man he was, but he also couldn't let what had happened slide without addressing it. Elijah turned his attention back to Alison, who was now fidgeting with her blazer, her embarrassment all too evident. "Alison, was it?" he asked, his voice even. She nodded quickly, her eyes darting to the floor. "Let me tell you a little story," Elijah began, his tone conversational but purposeful. "About 20 years ago, I was a kid growing up not too far from here. Back then, my family didn't have much. My mom worked 2 jobs, my dad drove a delivery truck, and we struggled to make ends meet. I remember walking by this very bank as a teenager, looking through the glass at the people inside, and thinking how different their lives seemed from mine." The room grew quieter as he spoke. Even those who had been focused on their own business couldn't help but listen. Elijah's voice carried a sense of honesty that drew people in, making them hang on to every word. I worked hard. He continued, his gaze steady on Alison. Got a few breaks along the way, but most of it came down to perseverance. I put myself through college, started a small business, and eventually built something I'm proud of. Owning this bank wasn't part of the original plan, but when the opportunity came along, I saw it as a chance to give back to the community that shaped me. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Alison's face had turned a deep shade of red, and she seemed frozen in place, unable to meet his gaze. The reason I'm telling you this, Elijah said, his voice softening slightly, is because I know what it feels like to be judged. To walk into a room and see people make assumptions about you before you've even said a word. And I also know how important it is for those assumptions to be challenged. Alison looked up at him then, her eyes wide with a mixture of regret and something else. Understanding, perhaps. She opened her mouth as if to apologize again, but Elijah didn't give her the chance. I'm not angry, he said, sensing her hesitation. Disappointed, maybe. But more than anything, I see this as an opportunity. An opportunity for you to reflect on how you approach situations like this in the future. The honesty in his words left no room for defensiveness. Alison nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand, she said, her tone sincere. And I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I truly am. Elijah studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. Apology accepted, he said simply. He then turned to the young teller behind the counter and smiled warmly. Thank you for your help earlier. You handled this with professionalism and kindness, and I appreciate that. The teller's face lit up with a grateful smile, and a few of the other employees exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the way Elijah had handled the situation. Just as it seemed the tension in the room was beginning to ease, Elijah looked back at Alison, his expression thoughtful. I'd like to have a conversation with you and the rest of the management team here, he said. Not today, but soon. It's important to me that everyone who walks into this bank feels respected and valued, regardless of how they're dressed or who they are. Alison nodded quickly, her demeanor humble. Of course, Mr. Carter. Whatever you think is best. Elijah offered her a polite smile, then glanced at his watch. For now, I think I've taken up enough of everyone's time. He turned to the crowd, offering an apologetic nod to the waiting customers. Thank you all for your patience. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted entirely. The tension that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by a sense of respect, not just for Elijah, but for the lesson he had imparted. As he walked toward the exit, the security guard by the door gave him a respectful nod. Have a good day, Mr. Carter, the guard said, his tone warm. Elijah returned the gesture with a smile. The doors of the bank closed behind him, and Elijah stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. He paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of the neighborhood. Despite the way the day had unfolded, he felt a deep sense of peace. Moments like these, he knew, were opportunities to plant seeds of change. What Elijah didn't know, however, was that this wasn't the end of the story. Inside the bank, Alison remained at the counter, still clutching his business card. Her mind raced as she replayed the encounter in her head, the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her shoulders. Something had shifted within her, and she knew she had a long road ahead to prove she had learned from this experience. For Elijah, the day's events were a reminder of why he had taken on the responsibility of owning the bank in the first place. It wasn't just about numbers or profit margins. It was about people. About creating a space where everyone, regardless of their background, felt seen and respected. And while today had been a step in the right direction, he also knew there was much work left to be done. Elijah walked down the street, the faint hum of the city buzzing around him. His mind replayed the events inside the bank. He wasn't angry, not in the way most people might have been. For Elijah, it wasn't about one person's behavior, but about a larger problem, one he had seen and experienced countless times. As much as he wanted to focus on the progress he had made in his life, moments like this reminded him of how far society still had to go. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Vanessa, his sister. How'd it go at the bank? Call me when you can, it read. Elijah smiled faintly. Vanessa had always been the more outspoken one in the family, the one who wouldn't have hesitated to confront Alison on the spot. He admired that about her, even though his own approach was different. He tucked his phone away, deciding to call her later. Right now, he needed time to process everything. As he reached his car, a sleek black sedan that stood out against the older vehicles parked along the street, a voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter." Elijah turned to see the young teller from the bank hurrying toward him. She was slightly out of breath, but wore a determined expression. "Hi," she said, catching her breath. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you said in there." Elijah tilted his head, intrigued. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "You were the one who handled things professionally. I should be thanking you." The teller shook her head. "No, I mean it. A lot of us feel the pressure to stay quiet when things like that happen. But seeing how you handled it, it reminded me that speaking up matters." Her words struck a chord with Elijah. He nodded thoughtfully. "What's your name?" "Kim," she said, extending her hand. He shook it firmly. "It's good to meet you, Kim. If you ever feel like you're in a position where you can't speak up, know that you've got an ally in me. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Kim smiled, her cheeks tinged with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means a lot." As Kim walked back toward the bank, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about setting an example for people like Alison. It was about empowering others like Kim to stand tall in the face of adversity. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his home office, a spacious yet modest room lined with bookshelves and family photos. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the day's events swirled in his mind. He knew he needed to address the situation at the bank more formally. Not to punish Alison, but to ensure that the culture within his organization aligned with the values he had worked so hard to build. He reached for his laptop and began drafting an email to the branch manager, requesting a meeting with the entire management team. He wanted to hear their perspectives, to understand where the gaps were and how they could be addressed. But more importantly, he wanted to create a space where these conversations could happen openly and constructively. Meanwhile, back at the bank, Alison sat at her desk long after closing hours. She stared at Elijah's business card, turning it over in her hands. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, embarrassment, regret, and a nagging sense of shame. But beneath it all was a growing resolve. Alison had always prided herself on being professional, on treating every customer with respect. Yet today had exposed a blind spot she hadn't realized she had. She replayed the way Elijah had handled the situation in her mind. His calm demeanor, his ability to address the issue without resorting to anger or accusations. It was humbling, to say the least. She pulled out a notebook and began jotting down her thoughts. If she was going to learn from this experience, she needed to start by acknowledging her own biases. And she needed to figure out how to ensure that her actions aligned with the values she believed in. The next day, as Elijah walked into his downtown office, he was greeted by his assistant, Marcus, who handed him a stack of files. "You've got a packed schedule today," Marcus said, glancing at his tablet. "But I thought you'd want to know. Alison from the branch called earlier. She asked if she could meet with you directly." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Did she say why?" Marcus shook his head, just that it was important. Elijah nodded, intrigued. "Schedule it for tomorrow. Let's see what she has to say." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and calls, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. Alison's request for a meeting was unexpected, but he welcomed the opportunity to continue the conversation. Back at the branch, Kim found herself reflecting on her brief interaction with Elijah. She had always felt overlooked at work, her contributions often overshadowed by louder, more assertive colleagues. But something about the way Elijah had acknowledged her efforts made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. As the sun set over the city, the pieces of the story began to weave together, each character grappling with their own thoughts and decisions. Elijah prepared for the days ahead, knowing that the journey toward change was rarely straightforward. Alison wrestled with her own realizations, determined to make amends and grow from her mistakes. And Kim, inspired by Elijah's words, began to find her own voice, ready to step into the spotlight she had long avoided. But the road ahead was far from smooth. Unspoken tensions simmered beneath the surface, and the deeper conflicts were only beginning to emerge. Elijah knew that addressing these issues would take time, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And as he looked out over the city's skyline that night, he couldn't help but wonder, was he ready for what lay ahead? The answer, he knew, didn't matter. Ready or not, the work had to be done. And he was determined to see it through. The next morning, Elijah arrived at his office earlier than usual. The air was crisp, the city just beginning to stir, but Elijah's mind was already racing. He was thinking about the meeting with Allison later that day. There were so many ways it could go, and he wanted to make sure that no matter what, the conversation stayed productive. It wasn't just about addressing her behavior. It was about creating an environment where these situations didn't happen again. Marcus walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder. He set 1 cup down in front of Elijah and gave him a quick update. Allison's meeting is confirmed for 1 this afternoon. She seemed nervous when I spoke to her. I think she knows she messed up. Elijah nodded, sipping his coffee. It's not about making her feel bad, he said. It's about helping her see the bigger picture. If she's willing to learn, this could be a turning point for her and for the branch. As the hours ticked by, Elijah went through his usual routine, but his thoughts kept circling back to the upcoming meeting. Meanwhile, across town, Allison was pacing nervously in her small apartment. She had spent the entire night going over what she wanted to say, but now that the moment was close, her confidence was wavering. How do you apologize to someone you've wronged so deeply, especially when the person holds so much power over your career? She glanced at the clock. It was almost time to leave. Grabbing her bag, she took a deep breath and headed out the door. At exactly 1 o'clock, Marcus led Allison into Elijah's office. She looked around, taking in the space. It was elegant, but not ostentatious, a reflection of the man who owned it. Elijah stood and greeted her warmly, his calm demeanor immediately putting her slightly at ease. "Thank you for coming," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I appreciate you reaching out." Allison sat down, clutching her bag tightly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mr. Carter. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I realize how wrong I was. I'm here because I want to apologize, not just to you, but to anyone else I may have treated unfairly without realizing it." Elijah leaned forward, studying her. "I appreciate your honesty, Allison, but understanding the why behind your actions is just as important as acknowledging them. Have you thought about what led you to respond the way you did?" Allison hesitated. "I have," she said finally, "and I think part of it comes from assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. I grew up in a small town where everyone looked and acted the same. When I moved to the city, I thought I had left that mindset behind, but clearly I haven't." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. Recognizing those biases is the first step. The real work comes in challenging them and making sure they don't dictate your actions. It's not easy, but it's necessary. The conversation continued, each word peeling back layers of misunderstanding and growth. Allison's vulnerability was evident, and Elijah respected her willingness to confront her own shortcomings. But as the meeting drew to a close, Elijah's mind turned to the larger issue, the culture within the bank. That evening, Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing the notes from his meeting with Allison. He had made it clear that her journey of self-reflection was just beginning, but he also knew that true change required more than individual accountability. It required systemic action. As he mulled over his next steps, his phone buzzed. It was Kim. She had sent him an email, attaching a detailed account of her experiences at the branch. Her words were raw and honest, shedding light on issues that went far beyond Allison's behavior. It was clear that the branch had deeper problems, ones that needed to be addressed immediately. Elijah's resolve hardened. He scheduled a meeting with the regional management team for the following week. This wasn't just about one branch or one person. It was about ensuring that every employee, regardless of their position, felt valued and respected. But even as Elijah moved forward with his plans, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Change was never easy, and he knew there would be resistance. Some people would welcome the shift, while others would see it as a threat to the status quo. And then there were the unspoken fears, the ones that crept into his mind late at night. What if he failed? What if the very system he had worked so hard to build resisted him? The next day, Elijah returned to the branch for an unannounced visit. He wanted to see things as they truly were, without the polished facade that often accompanied official inspections. As he walked through the doors, he felt the weight of every gaze that turned his way. Some employees looked nervous, others curious. But one thing was clear: his presence had sent ripples through the room. Kim approached him cautiously, her usual professionalism tinged with a hint of excitement. "Mr. Carter, it's good to see you again. Is there something I can assist you with?" "I'm just here to observe," Elijah said with a smile. "Carry on as usual." As he moved through the branch, he noticed small details that spoke volumes. The way certain employees interacted with each other, the subtle hierarchies that played out in their body language, the moments of hesitation that revealed underlying tensions. It was all there, waiting to be uncovered. By the time Elijah left, he had a clearer picture of what needed to be done. But he also knew that the road ahead would be anything but smooth. The climax of this journey was approaching, and with it, a reckoning that would challenge everyone involved. Back in his car, Elijah took a deep breath and looked out at the bustling street. Change was coming, whether people were ready for it or not. And as he drove away, the weight of the moment settled over him like a storm on the horizon, building and intensifying, ready to break at any moment. As Elijah drove away from the branch, his mind was a storm of thoughts and possibilities. He had seen enough during his unannounced visit to confirm that change was imperative, but he also couldn't ignore the resistance simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just Allison or the other employees who seemed uneasy. It was the culture itself, deeply rooted in habits and assumptions that wouldn't be easy to dismantle. Later that evening, as Elijah sat in his home office, his phone buzzed. It was an email notification marked urgent. He opened it, expecting a routine update, but the contents made him pause. The email wasn't from an employee, but from a customer, someone who had been at the branch the day of the initial incident. The man had witnessed the exchange between Allison and Elijah and had something starting to share. The customer claimed to have overheard a conversation in the lobby after Elijah had left that day. According to him, a group of employees had gathered near the coffee machines, speaking in hushed but animated tones. One voice in particular stood out. A senior manager from another department who had made an offhand comment about Elijah's ownership of the bank. "Well, let's see how long he keeps that title," the voice had said, followed by laughter that sent a chill down the customer's spine. Elijah's heart sank as he reread the email. He had expected resistance to the changes he was implementing. This was something else entirely. The comment wasn't just dismissive. It was laced with something more sinister, a veiled threat that suggested not everyone was on his side. The email included a timestamp and a description of the individuals involved, providing enough detail for Elijah to take it seriously. The next morning, Elijah called Marcus into his office. Marcus, ever the professional, immediately noticed the tension in Elijah's expression. "What's going on?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. Elijah handed him the printed email. "Read this and tell me what you think." Marcus scanned the page, his face darkening as he read. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at Elijah. "This is serious. If someone within the bank is actively undermining you, it's not just a personal issue. It's a threat to the entire organization." Elijah nodded. "Exactly. And if there's even a shred of truth to this, I need to act quickly. But I also need to be smart about it. I can't just walk into the branch and start accusing people without evidence." Marcus leaned back, thinking, "We need to approach this carefully. Maybe it's time to bring in an external auditor, someone impartial who can look into the culture and identify any underlying issues. If there's a problem, they'll find it." Elijah considered this. It was a logical step, but it also felt like conceding that the problem had grown beyond his control. Still, he knew Marcus was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the integrity of the institution he had built. Later that day, Elijah made a few discreet phone calls to arrange for an external consultant to begin an evaluation of the branch. In the meantime, he decided to take a different approach. He called Kim and asked her to meet him at a coffee shop near the branch after work. If anyone could shed light on what was happening, it was her. When Kim arrived, she looked both curious and concerned. "Is everything okay, Mr. Carter?" she asked as she sat down across from him. Elijah smiled reassuringly. "I just wanted to check in with you. You've been at the branch for a while now, and I trust your judgment. I need to know, have you noticed anything unusual among the staff lately? Any conversations or behaviors that seemed out of place?" Kim hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. She took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "There's definitely been a lot of talk since your visit," she admitted. "Some people are excited about the changes you're planning, but others, not so much. I've heard whispers, mostly in passing, about how things were better before. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Elijah with a mix of worry and guilt. "Is something wrong?" Elijah weighed his words carefully. "Let's just say there might be more resistance to these changes than I initially thought. I'm not asking you to spy on your colleagues, Kim, but if you notice anything concerning, please let me know." Kim nodded, her expression serious. "I will. And for what it's worth, I think the changes you're making are long overdue. If you need my support, you have it." Elijah felt a surge of gratitude. Kim's loyalty and integrity were a reminder of why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. But as he left the coffee shop that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The second plot twist had been set in motion, and the stakes were higher than ever. Somewhere within the walls of his own bank, forces were working against him, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. Elijah returned to his office the next day, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The external consultant had already started conducting interviews with the branch staff, and the air was thick with tension. Employees exchanged nervous glances as whispers traveled faster than the coffee machine could brew. Elijah knew that whatever the findings were, they would change everything, either confirming his worst fears or revealing something he hadn't yet considered. By late afternoon, the consultant, a composed woman named Diane, requested a meeting. As Elijah sat across from her in his office, he studied her calm demeanor, trying to gauge what she might say. Diane placed a folder on the desk and began. "Mr. Carter, I've completed the initial assessment, and I've uncovered some concerning dynamics of the branch. It's clear there's a division among the staff. While some employees genuinely support your vision, others feel threatened by it. But that's not all." She paused, her tone growing serious. "There's evidence of deliberate sabotage. Emails deleted, records altered, subtle things that might not have caught your attention, but could have serious implications for the branch's performance." Elijah felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Do you know who's behind it?" Diane nodded, sliding the folder across the desk. "It appears to be orchestrated by someone in a senior position. Allison is involved, but she's not acting alone. There's a small group, 3 or 4 individuals, who seem to be working together. They've been careful, but their actions are coordinated." Elijah opened the folder, his eyes scanning the detailed report. As he read, his mind raced. The evidence was clear, but it wasn't just about identifying the culprits. It was about understanding why. What had driven them to this? Was it fear, resentment, or something deeper? The next morning, Elijah called a staff meeting at the branch. The atmosphere was tense as employees filed into the room, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright apprehension. Elijah stood at the front, his posture confident but approachable. "I want to thank all of you for taking the time to meet today. I've spent the past few weeks observing, listening, and trying to understand the culture of this branch. And while I've seen a lot of great work being done, I've also seen things that need to change." He paused, letting his words settle. I'm not here to point fingers or lay blame, but I can't ignore what's come to light. Some of you have chosen to resist the changes we're making, and while I respect differing opinions, sabotage is something I cannot and will not tolerate. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Alison sat stiffly in her chair, her face a mask of indifference, but her clenched fists betrayed her unease. Elijah continued, his voice firm but calm. I've brought in an external consultant to help us navigate these challenges, and the findings are clear. If we're going to succeed as a team, we need to address these issues head-on. As Elijah finished speaking, Diane stepped forward to present her findings. The room was filled with gasps and murmurs as she outlined the evidence of sabotage, careful not to name names in front of the group. The atmosphere shifted from tense to charged, and Elijah could feel the weight of unspoken accusations hanging in the air. After the meeting, Elijah asked Alison to stay behind. As the last of the employees trickled out, she crossed her arms defensively, avoiding his gaze. So what now? She asked, her tone sharp. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes steady. That depends on you, Alison. You've been with this branch for a long time, and I know you've contributed a lot. But this behavior can't continue. I'm giving you a choice. Either you commit to being part of the solution, or you step aside. For a moment, Alison said nothing. Then, to Elijah's surprise, her expression softened. You don't understand, do you? She said quietly. It's not just about you or the changes you're making. It's about what those changes mean for people like me, people who've spent years working our way up, only to feel like we're being pushed aside. Elijah listened, realizing that beneath her defiance was a deep-seated fear of losing her place in a rapidly changing world. Alison, he said gently, this isn't about replacing anyone. It's about building something better for all of us. But that can only happen if we work together. Alison looked at him for a long moment, and then, with a reluctant nod, she said, All right, I'll try. Elijah knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. As Alison left the room, Diane approached, a small smile on her face. You handled that well, she said. But there's one more thing you need to know. Elijah frowned. What is it? Diane handed him another folder. During my investigation, I came across something unexpected. There's been a pattern of financial discrepancies, small amounts, spread across multiple accounts. It didn't seem significant at first, but when I looked closer, it all led back to one person. Elijah opened the folder and froze. The name on the page wasn't one of the saboteurs. It was someone he had trusted completely. Marcus. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. As he read through the details, the pieces began to fall into place. Marcus had been embezzling funds, using his position to cover his tracks. And all the while, he had been standing by Elijah's side, pretending to support him. Elijah closed the folder, his mind reeling. The sabotage, the resistance, it had all been a distraction, a smokescreen to keep him from seeing the real betrayal. And now, as he prepared to confront the person he had considered his closest ally, he realized the true battle was just beginning.